Good evening and welcome to this Thinking. I'm David, one of the editors at Tortoise. I want you to know that I did try to find a Nicki Minaj song to bring us in, but I couldn't find one that we could all cope with. So there we go, a bit of early elbow. So the question tonight, what is America for now in the world? We've just witnessed, the catastrophic US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And even though I think there's no doubt some sympathy for closing that long and costly chapter, no one thinks it's been well handled. The Taliban's back, gains for women and girls have been lost. We all fear what might happen to human rights and to, oxygen perhaps being given to terrorists in that land. But here we are with this inescapable feeling that the US has somehow lost some credibility or moral authority, and perhaps even its reputation for competence. So there's a really disturbing backdrop, whichever side of the Atlantic you're on. And no doubt, you probably think you're coming tonight to bash the US, and there's a lot of things to get concerned about. You can think of just in recent times the storming of the Capitol, the clearly deep divisions on race and economic inequality, the antics of Trump, the abortion restrictions in Texas, the voting restrictions in Texas, the anti-vax madness in Florida, Nicki Minaj and her cousin's friend's unfortunate swelling. There's a lot going on, a lot to be concerned about. But as ever, even though we want to hear your thoughts, I'm quite keen to kind of push past relitigating the charge sheet and think about, well, how does America position itself in the world going forward? So I think you can get ready for some very big ideas because we've got two great guests tonight. We've got Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was a policy chief at the State Department. Hello, Anne-Marie, nice to see you. Anne-Marie's coming to us from Princeton, New Jersey. She was a policy chief in the State Department during the first term of the Obama administration, and she runs the New America think tank in DC, as well as having the links to Princeton, where she does politics and international affairs still. And she'd just written a book. This is not the approved cover, but it is it's an unapproved cover. It's called Renewal: From Crisis to Transformation in Our Lives, Work and Politics. And we're going to get into that in a moment. And we've also got Alec Ross, hi Alec.
Hello.
Good to see you from Baltimore this day. And I can do this all night. Alec has got one of these. It came out in the UK. In fact, I think it comes out in the UK tomorrow. It came out in the US today. The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future. So there's a lot to chew on from both of them. As ever, we want to hear from you. We don't just want this to be a panel discussion. So you know what to do in the chat. Make your opinions known there, and we'll be bringing you forward to join the debate. But I wonder if I could, just to get us started, I'd really like to ask you both the same question. I wonder, Anne-Marie, if I could start with you. And it's a pretty simple question. How damaged do you think the US is by the chaotic withdrawal and the reversal of fortunes we've seen in Afghanistan in the last couple of months?
Well, Dave, it's a pleasure. And I was around at Tortoise's inception, so I'm delighted to participate now. The United States is definitely damaged, but you're putting that on top of really a disastrous record with COVID, where we now have more deaths, over 600,000 deaths. That's more deaths than in all the wars since World War II, including World War II. And even before that, if you go back, we've had government shutdowns. We had the election of Trump and the visible disintegration of norms that upheld our democracy, January 6th. So yes, leaving Afghanistan the way we did has been, I think, another sign of a changing United States in the world. You can certainly see it as a sign of incompetence. I don't think that probably the leaving itself is the problem, or at least it certainly is not inside the United States. It was the manner of our leaving, and perhaps particularly for Britain, Joe Biden, who is all about multilateralism and allies, really didn't even consult. So for all those countries who stood with us 20 years ago on 9/11, that's just an additional blow and an additional sign that the role we're going to play in the world is changing.
Well, that's a full-throated start. The incompetence word is ringing in my ears already. Can I throw that to you, Alec? How damaged do you think the US is by, choose your time frame, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan or everything else?
Well, look, I do, not surprisingly, I do strongly agree with Anne-Marie that this will not be viewed in isolation by foreign publics or by foreign leaders. It does flow from a recent history of 4 years of the Trump administration, which were very difficult in terms of the transatlantic relationship and with most of our relationships globally. You can go back to the Iraq War, which I believe in many respects was the beginning of the descent of the view of the United States by the non-American public. What I will say about Afghanistan, let me focus in on two aspects of it. The first thing is I think that the United States itself came in hobbled, fresh off of the experience of the Trump administration and the January 6th protests. I think that who this really damages in part is Biden and the Biden administration, where I think that there was much more hope that his administration would manage the transatlantic relationship well, that he would restore a set of norms and a sense of confidence in the United States. And I do think that the manner in which we withdrew significantly diminishes that. What I do think, though, is that in many respects, the diminished view of the United States will largely be concentrated in elite circles specific to Afghanistan. I do think that most people will, frankly, they will have forgotten about this within 60 days. And I think that most of the American citizens will have forgotten about it within 60 days. Who I don't think will forget are those people who have to interact with the United States government. I think, I've spoken with a number of foreign ministers and others who view this as a signal that even in a post-Trump America, they need to go back to some of their assumptions about America during the Trump years, that we really need to forge our own path at this point.
Yes, thank you for that. That's a great start. So, Anne-Marie, I wonder again if I could just come back to you just to think of some of the early consequences of this withdrawal, and clearly, however we view the handling of the TikTok, there was an exhaustion about having American military boots on the ground that had to be engaged with, and it does make me wonder. Do you see? I think I'm right in saying you were at state when Obama, activated the surge in Afghanistan. So you've had very vivid experience of this. But I wonder, is this era of American military boots on the ground over for the foreseeable future? Can you see any circumstances where the US might step in militarily around the world?
I think it's mostly over. And I will say, again, yes, I was at the State Department in 2009. Alec and I were both there. We agree a lot because we're good friends and we spent a lot of time together. But yes, they conducted a huge review. Obama wanted to pull the troops out. The military convinced him not to. Biden was opposed to that decision. And Biden's been very clear that he didn't think it was the right decision then, and he wasn't going to be pushed around by the military now. And I don't think he had enough people around him to really challenge him and describe what could happen and where he's going to be damaged in the veterans community, because that's another area, I think, Alec, that they're not going to forget, because we left people behind, and that's not forgivable. And that's a community that Biden cares a great deal about. But more broadly, if you look at the Afghan economy, it grew quite quickly after we first went in. From about 2009 to now, it's been completely stagnant. The Taliban were steadily, gaining ground, gaining territory. The violence level was rising. even for Afghan women, and I deeply supported all the work that we did, their education was and opportunities were increasingly limited to major cities. So I think there's sort of a general sense that we can't do this. We never could do this, nation building through military troops. It requires security, but we never even got enough security, and we didn't have the other tools. We didn't have the development tools. We didn't have the diplomatic tools. So I do think we're heading into an era in which the only place you're going to see troops deployed would be for something like the initial deployment to basically chase Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. That kind of short, limited mission, particularly with special operations, but probably also with some other troops in response to a direct attack, will do that. Otherwise, it's drones and droids all the way.
Drones and droids, wow. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? I think it's understandable that that both of you emphasized the things that you did in measuring the downfall of the image of the US as a competent force, a force of moral probity in those recent years, and you know, clearly, you know, we can look back to the start of the war on terror to identify that moment where the US lost its moral compass. But I wonder, either of you could take this really. I wonder if you look back at on your years. You know, we think of, or many people do, of the Obama era as a more benign one, but you know, you can see in some of the decisions taken and not that the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan was over them, and so you think of the toppling of Gaddafi, but you know, leaving a vacuum behind, Syria not toppling Assad, and frankly, you know, the world sitting on its hands when chemical weapons were being used against children. I wonder if you have any moments where you regret decisions taken and not taken there.
Well, I'll respond very quickly and say that I'll speak for myself. I regretted some of those at the time, and you know, Anne-Marie and I were more often than not voices of dissent on some of these issues. For example, I believe Anne-Marie Slaughter was the first prominent person from sort of who had served within the administration to call for a no-fly zone, for example, in Syria. And so, look, a lot of us going into the Obama administration thought he would be sort of a new FDR, that the change would not be evolutionary, it would be revolutionary. And in fact, what in many respects it turned out to be that was sort of the third and fourth Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. It was very much in line with what I consider to be a lot of the approaches taken during the Clinton administration on both foreign policy and on domestic policy. Though it was a far more kinetic time than was the case during the 1990s under Clinton. And so certainly, yes, I mean, I don't think, I'll speak for myself, I would not put a halo over anybody's heads for, you know, our service during the Obama administration. I do think, obviously, it was much more effectively managed. I think that a lot of what we did in terms of the Iran Accords opening relations with Cuba and a few other things was obviously quite positive. But at the end of the day, it was not revolutionary change. It was not a repivoting of America's place in the world post-Cold War. It was, in fact, just a sort of continuation of a certain kind of consensus approach to how the United States manages its affairs on the 196-country chessboard.
I would agree with that with the following kind of qualification, which is, I think that's right. I mean, America's ratings went way up after Obama came in. It was astonishing. He was getting 70, 80, 90% approval in Europe, which almost nobody ever does.
And the Nobel Peace Prize on day one, virtually.
Exactly. So there was a real honeymoon, but I agree with Alec that there was not the kind of real change in the way we led that many of us were expecting. I will say, though, and I think it's important for a British audience, if you look back, you can see that Obama is more dubious than Bill Clinton and than any Cold War American about the idea that American power, the use of American power, is generally benign. And that is because his father was Kenyan. That's also because he was raised African. He's African American by America's insane definitions of race. And so he, when he looked at sort of Great Britain, he did not see what I see. My grandfather fought next to the Britons in World War II as a Belgian soldier. I see the special relationship. I went to Oxford, all of that. He saw, I think, much more the kind of colonial footprint, imperialist footprint. And that obviously Trump pulled back for very different reasons. But as the United States becomes more and more diverse, and it will become a plurality nation by 2040, and Americans under 30 by 2027, we're going to have a different view of past uses of American power. And I don't think you see it yet with Biden, but I think it's coming.
Interesting. Now, I suppose the step forward from that, if we accept, I think all of us on this call probably think, that word incompetence is resonating, but there is this huge to-do list of never-ending global problems. I suppose, if you think of climate change or inequality or vaccine fairness or tax avoidance or the next pandemic, these are problems in search of coalitions to solve them. So I guess the question is who ultimately does that work and who can build those coalitions. But really, the first order of business does seem to be, and I don't know how long we have for this to take, but how can the US recover its composure, its standing? And I think, Anne-Marie, just to come to your book, you have the title is Renewal. You talk about a lot of R words. You sort of weigh in the balance reinvention or restoration, but you settle on renewal. And I wonder if you would mind just walking us through what you see as the distinctions there, the nuances, and why you think the US needs to enter a phase of renewal.
Well, I do choose renewal very deliberately, and I say it's in between revolution, it's in between reform and revolution, and it's in between restoration and reinvention. It's sort of that balance, but it's not just the sort of happy middle. I really believe that we need to look backward and forward at the same time if we're going to have transformation. The United States is a whole country of people who believe we can reinvent ourselves. We've got, endless books on how to do it. In this instance, unless we look really hard at where we've been, and that is in foreign policy, but it is very much in domestic policy. And most of the books that have been bestsellers this year many of them are African Americans who are saying, here's a part of our history that we have been simply unwilling to face, say in something like How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith. There are new Americans, and again, we're becoming a plurality country whose sense of our history is very different. And my point is, you have to face that history. You have to have a reckoning, probably reparations of some kind. But at the same time, this is why I like renewal, because it's got both in it. You must envisage something new, and you must have the hope and confidence necessary to build it. And Alec's book talks about a new social contract and labor power. I mean, he really outlines what we could do together, but we've got to renew the promise of America. We have to renew the commitment to our founding ideals, but we have to recognize that for many, many Americans, those ideals were never true. And now think about what will it take in renewing that commitment to actually make them true.
And you have this phrase, brutal honesty, in
radical honesty
in your book, that I think, I mean, directly you're referring there to indigenous Native Americans and genocide, and clearly the consequences of the stain of slavery. But I did just want to touch on a couple of ways you take up that challenge, because you walk through some sacred texts in every sense of the word, from Little House on the Prairie to the Declaration of Independence, don't you? In sort of rather puncturing the balloon, I suppose. So you found Little House on the Prairie to be quite racist on reflection, on returning to it.
Without any question. It doesn't take a lot. Any of those books with current eyes, you're kind of appalled at how racist or sexist they were. But even there, I'm saying it comes in a chapter where I talk about rugged interdependence. And what I'm doing is saying, look, the trope of US history, it was always a trope, it was always a myth, is rugged individualism. And certainly for many immigrants who set out across the front, to find the frontier, to expand the frontier, there was a lot of rugged individualism, although it's a phrase that was created by Herbert Hoover in the early 20s, actually, in 1921, Alec, where he's running for president and he's contrasting rugged individualism with European style socialism. My point is, if you look at the stories of the women who were in the wagon trains, who went across the country, or if you look at the stories of African Americans who went from south to north with the Underground Railroad, you actually don't hear stories of individualism and independence, but of interdependence and solidarity and relying on one another against the elements or against the white owners or enslavers. And so that's a whole strand of American history that we need to bring back. But what I say about Laura Ingalls Wilder is, yes, it is racist today, but I read those books as a little girl and could at least identify with some parts of them, even as I revise other parts dramatically now. And that's, again, this dual movement of being radically honest, but also looking to something new and having a measure of hope and confidence in the nation we are, because we will never live up to our own potential otherwise, and we won't get out of the hole we're in otherwise.
Mm-hmm. There's for anyone who's been to the Museum of African American History in the Mall, there's an amazing treatment of a statue of Jefferson as you go in, and it's called The Paradox of Liberty. And you see him standing there, founding father, and noble, elegant intellect, and he's set against a sort of wall of bricks of about 600 bricks, which are all engraved with the names of the slaves that he owned. And it makes precisely that point that you can honor his many achievements, but you must not be myopic about the wider context, I suppose.
He enslaved his own children, but there is a tendency, to read it all one way or another. This is both and I'll just say, I see the growing diversity of our country as our greatest strength. I think in the world as well. I think that's true for many European countries, but we don't think that way, and we don't have the tools and the tech and the sort of policies to really build the whole web of relationships that our changing people can now build with, not just across the North Atlantic, but with the world as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your point there, which is developed in the book, is this, isn't it, that America is for now a majority white nation, but not for much longer, and you definitely see opportunities there, I think.
Enormous ones, but I mean, we will become a plurality nation. So in 2026, it'll be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. For those 250 years, we were such a white majority nation. Everybody else is a minority, and if you think about an American, you think that person is white. For the next 250 years, that will not be true. Whites will still be the biggest plurality, or at least probably for this century. But Americans will be in all hues, all different groups, multiracial in many ways. To me, again, that is the fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence, because it says all men are created equal. It meant all white men, but really it means all humans are created equal. And that is a vision of who we are that China's never going to have. It is consistent with the values we espouse, even if we don't live up to them. But we have to take it on board. It's also the kind of turbulence along with the technological turbulence. And again, Alec talks about the technology in his book that may mean we're at risk of tearing ourselves apart. The combined social and economic change that is being brought about by demography and technology is seismic.
Yes, and certainly you wouldn't bet against the tearing ourselves apart version of the next period.
That's why you write books and try to shape things as best you can.
Well, speaking of people who write books, I think there's a guy on this call, Alec. You've written a book. My sense is that you sort of approach the challenges facing us all globally from a slightly different angle. There's in your book, countries are diminished. Companies, on the other hand, wield enormous influence across borders, and it's a theme that we've talked about at Tortoise as well. The sort of company as nation state. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that looks like in your view, the power that companies have for good and ill in a changing world.
Sure. So thank you. So I do think that in many respects right now, there are many, many companies that are as powerful as countries. And they have power that they can wield more efficiently and effectively oftentimes than a nation state. And so as I was writing this book, The Raging 2020s, and thinking about the way in which we needed to rewrite our social contract, I couldn't help but note that on a variety of different issues, from workers' rights to the minimum wage to sustainability to a number of other issues, we're actually more governed by companies than we are by countries. And when I think about power, part of what Anne-Marie has written about so compellingly over the years is wielding power, the exercise of power, the accumulation and demonstration of power. And when we think about that in a traditional context, we think of it rooted in the power of the state. But what I increasingly believe is true is that there are these fairly new actors on the scene now, the Amazons, the Googles, the Apples, who on so many of the issues that determine our well-being, they have as much to do with the degree to which we are or are not rewriting our social contract, whether they are paying tax or not, whether they are, what kind of sustainability practices are in place. And I've spent time with leaders in government as well as leaders of a lot of these big companies, and have sort of been eyewitness to the ways in which they exercise power. And it's fairly remarkable for both good and ill, because they are not constrained by democratic consent. They are not constrained by something having to go through a parliamentary body. They oftentimes are very hierarchical organizations that also benefit from having the world's very best human capital working for them. I mean, through much of the post World War II era, it was very prestigious to go from the world's best universities into government. So if you graduated from one of America's high-flying universities and you were an economics student, you would go to the Treasury. If you studied international relations, you would become a foreign service officer or go work at the CIA. The same was true in many respects in the UK, where your highest flying new graduates of Cambridge and Oxford would go into the civil service, or they would go into the foreign service. And what's really happened since the late 80s is now they go into McKinsey. Now they go into Goldman Sachs. And then something began about 15 years ago where now they go into Google. Now they go into Amazon. These are really the catchment places for some of the world's very best talent. And one of the things that the United States has always been very good at is it draws from that talent globally. Silicon Valley, for example, is a place geographically, but if you walk into the cafeterias at any of those places at lunchtime, you will hear 15 different languages spoken. And so what I really think that we need to come to grasp with is the power that exists inside these companies. Mm-hmm. Are we going to live and work in a world where there is democratic consent? In a world of globalization, where capital can move very freely and where a company can really sort of customize its social contract. It can choose the the tax policies of a tax haven. It can choose the labor policies of a China. It can choose the capital policies of the United States. What we see is in this world of shareholder capitalism, these very big and very powerful companies sort of custom making their social contract to optimize for shareholder value. And look, it leaves a lot of bodies and a few $100 billion in its wake.
I wonder, it's a beguiling thought, isn't it, that if all of those trillions of dollars that are no longer going to be spent with military occupation in places like Afghanistan, what would happen if you pointed some of that money at trying to eradicate tax havens? It's clearly a sort of it's a priority for the G7 countries. That seems like a thing that America could have people rally around.
Well, look, I mean, I will not hesitate to criticize Joe Biden when it's called for, and I did prior in this discussion, but let's give him an enormous amount of credit taking leadership on global tax. Mm-hmm. This is something the United States has been mute about for a very long time. I know there's discussion in the UK right now about potential tax hikes. I've got news for you. It looks like we've got 70 or so odd people on this chat right now. I would bet that of those 70 some people, even assuming a very high average household income, I still bet north of 60 of those people would pay less in taxes if we did a better job of addressing tax avoidance and tax evasion. And a point that I make, let's go back and talk about the power of the state for the moment. We can finger wag about what it means in a world where a FedEx driver pays less in federal taxes than Federal Express, where the barista at Starbucks pays less in taxes than Starbucks Corporation. But what they're doing is legal, and that is a problem. The fact that Google, for example, does transfer tens of billions of dollars around the map in this sort of bizarre shell game is actually technically legal. None of those guys are going to jail. And so one of the things that I think is quite important for a Boris Johnson, for a Joe Biden and others to really throw their shoulder into is address this excruciatingly boring and complex and important issue of global tax. If we do that, then we can stop thinking about how to squeeze more resources out of our working and middle classes.
Very good. Well, here's another issue that the US could lead on, but has not, notably to date. I wonder if I might just come to Raj, who's in the chat. And I think, Raj, you've been talking about vaccine fairness. I wonder if you want to make your point. How you doing? Have we got you, Raj?
I'm trying to unmute.
Yeah, you're there. You're good.
Great. Hi. Thanks very much. Sorry, I was in cooking. So just popped out of the kitchen to say thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Your point, Alex, is very related to what I've been looking to, which is the power of the pharma industry and its investors to shape how the world responds to a pandemic. It's basically an old style private voluntary initiative with a bit of donations chucked in. It's not really an effective economic strategy or a public health strategy, and it's certainly not good for international collaboration. Yeah. My question is, what do you think progressive centrist people can do about the power, particularly of US fund managers and corporations, because they're sort of no accountability mechanism as that I can see operating?
Well, I mean, I would respond very quickly by saying, make sure they pay their fair share of taxes. And let me just be very, very unguarded about this. I'm also a partner in a venture capital fund. We have over $1 billion of assets under management. The money that I make is more a function of the appreciation of capital than the salary I get paid by a university. And I just wrote this book, The Raging 2020s, and I bet the percentage of my income that I pay this year will be lower than that of the 25-year-old research assistants who work for me. That is fundamentally unjust. And that is because we tax capital appreciation differently than we tax labor. And so to your question of how you bring the power of these fund managers and others under control is make sure we pay our fair share to pay for the education system, to pay for the public health system. I mean, the fact that my taxes are as low as they are relative to my 25-year-old research assistant is really unjustifiable. But what you're not going to get is somebody sort of writing donations to the Treasury. That's not the way this works. So the state still matters. And so we do need to bring economic justice to the issue of tax in order to be able to pay for so much of the rest of what we aspire to do as a state and as a society. And I think that where we see the exercise of power from the sort of billionaire class and from the fund manager class is really opposing the kinds of changes in tax. And you see it in London. I write in The Raging 2020s, this book of mine that comes out tomorrow. I write at substantial length about the city. The city is probably the most powerful lobbying organization in the world. Now that the National Rifle Association has a little bit more diminished power in the United States, I would say the power of the city and its reach into government's labor and Tory alike is fairly remarkable. And I think that the United States needs to come to grips with its unjust tax system. I think the UK needs to come to terms with the fact that it cannot wall the city and its financial services industry off from responsibility. And until then, we're just going to see this power continue to accumulate.
Just before we move away from companies, I'd love you just to sort of just throw something else into the mix, which is the Walmart example from your book, because if I've understood this correctly, biggest company in the world by revenue, and actually I think the parable that you tell is that there is sometimes power within a company to move faster to change things that need to be changed than governments who, particularly in the US example, are rather hidebound by what happens on Capitol Hill. So yeah, the Walmart example.
Yeah, so the example that David is pointing to has to do with laundry detergent. Remember, not so very long ago, when you bought a bottle of laundry detergent, it was this great big thing, and you would pour 12 ounces of laundry detergent into your washing machine to wash your clothes. We don't do that anymore. We have concentrated laundry detergent, and even the liquid stuff, you just put a little bit in there, and we have smaller packaging. That was decided by one company. Walmart decided to stop selling what it considered to be very wasteful cleaning materials. And because it was so powerful, it imposed itself on the global supply chain. And all around the Western world now, we consume cleaning materials differently. And there's data, I don't have the numbers memorized, though I should memorize them. The amount of plastics, paper, and environmental waste that has been decreased because of that decision is fairly spectacular. And my point in all of this is that it's not, I think it's unproductive to just sort of finger wag at big companies and say, you're malignant actors, you ought to have less power. When in fact, I think that because of their great power, they can do great good. I give another example. I purposefully picked companies that we tend to put a black hat over and say, look at the good they can do. And I give another example of Goldman Sachs, which is this sort of very caricature of rapacious capitalism in the eyes of many. But what they did under this new CEO, David Solomon, is they created a diversity requirement for any company that they would take public. And they are the most powerful investment bank in the world. They take, all of the hotshot startups that go public. They are the ones that do them. And they realized that 40% of the companies that they took public, 40% had all white, all male boards. And they created a diversity requirement. They said, if you do not have a diversity board, if you do not have diversity on your board, we will not take you public. And then they said, and 1 year from now, it can't just be one person, it has to be two people. And they got a lot of crap from, the good old boy, oil and gas guys and what have you. And they stood their ground and they said, you know what? Tough. We won't take you public. And in so doing, they fundamentally change the dialogues that are taking place in private equity and venture capital around the world right now, where they say, if we don't diversify our boards, we do not have access to global capital in the way in which we did previously. So you can see with Walmart on sustainability and Goldman Sachs on access to global capital markets, these big companies can be really positive actors. What I think we need to do is we need to create more incentives for them to be responsible, progressive actors.
Yeah.
But I agree with a lot of that. And I actually think for America in the world and for the problems that we have to solve, climate change and global pandemics, biodiversity, all of those, what is America for? That America has to be the government, the corporate sector, the civic sector, and various other, like the scientific establishment, faith groups, et cetera, that we have to disaggregate our power and recognize it and harness it. But I will say that in addition to fighting a fair tax code, and in America, we constantly legislate social policy through tax cuts or tax incentives. The other thing that corporations as a whole lobby against is any kind of change in our political system, which is deeply broken. And so there's a ways in which they will do exactly what Alec is suggesting if they can do it voluntarily, but they still fight really hard against the provision of public goods more broadly, and as I said, the kind of changes in our political system that would allow us to have sane social policy.
I'm just going to throw to my colleague Tessa Murray, who's in the chat talking about a couple of things, notably most recently observing quite rightly that multilateralism then is dead, but progressive consumerism is our future. But Tessa, I wondered if you would just make a couple of points about reparations, because I think we caught your ear earlier on.
Yeah, I think if we thank you, Alec and Anne-Marie, this is great. I just want to sort of rewind back to sort of the bigger question, and that is, is there ever really a significant chance of success for America's sort of cohesive future if there isn't something that seriously addresses the question of reparations, and that there is a sort of truth and reconciliation process on a significant scale that will prepare the US for the multiplicity of ethnic majorities and minorities that are coming down the line. And I know we've had a bit of a chat in the chat, thanks Anne-Marie, about just how feasible it is to deliver that, what the process would be, and my point, who has the political will or leadership to actually achieve a project on that scale. And I take your point about discounting the per capita approach, because you've got to define who, but I worry that something that's based on access to pools of money is not blanket enough to actually really deal with the incredibly deep-rooted and frankly, the long overdue reparations for the horrors of that time. So that was what I was sort of just picking up on, Dave. If you need a seriously sort of foundational shift to give the US a hope of facing its future collectively.
Anne-Marie, do you want to pick that up?
I do, and at the end, so I should just say, Renewal is a highly personal story of my own leadership crisis and transformation, and then I weave that together with what that sort of radical honesty and exercising power differently and building resilience and thinking about risk differently, what that would mean at the national level. And at the end, I have a vision of 2026 that actually includes Biden appointing this year a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that it would issue its report the year before the anniversary. Again, I was 18 during the bicentennial. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came over. It was a very big deal, and it will be a moment of reflection and commemoration, and I hope change. I don't see Biden right now. He's not going to spend his political capital on that. The we'll see what happens in the midterm elections, but we are not at a point where I think we can do that nationally, as much as I think we need to do that. I am taking heart from some local efforts. Evanston, Illinois is actually trying to put in place reparations that is much more on a per capita basis. Although many folks of color will say, wait a minute, I'm descended from enslaved ancestors. Somebody else may have come from a wealthy family in Nigeria a decade ago. And, so how are you going to make that determination? I would be very happy to have experimentation on the local level and then perhaps at the state level. I think ultimately there has to be national recognition, but I grew up in the American South. The feeling of threat that the white majority, and still absolutely the folks who have the power, but the feeling of threat they're under, you all know this in Europe. I mean, Brexit, that's a big part of Brexit, is the fear of immigrants, right? It is manipulated by politicians. And think about the former Yugoslavia, all of it was kind of fear of the other. And I think we can ultimately get there, but I'm not sort of Pollyannish about just disregarding the divisions that we're currently in. So yes, over time, I think we've got to get there. I don't see it happening in the form you're talking about soon. I do think, though, things like rebuilding from COVID by fueling entrepreneurship, which is, of course, a great American kind of idea of itself, particularly in communities across the country where women, but particularly Black and brown entrepreneurs, have never been able to get capital, is the kind of thing you might get political consensus on.
And cities could certainly choose, cities like Chicago could choose to actually invest in something other than policing in some of their
very much so.
Neighborhoods. Perhaps jobs and schools might be something. I'm really conscious that we're rapidly running out of time. I would love to just engage, if we can, with I suppose it's something about how the US can play its role differently. I think if this is those moments of the 9/11 commemorations, the reflections around that, if this is a moment of humility and quiet reflection for America, I wonder, I might ask this of both of you. I'll start with you, Alec, if I could. How do you think the US can play its role differently on the world stage? One of our members earlier on was right at the start of the session was sort of making the point that there is, you can approach this question that we've asked tonight of, well, what does America want, but what do we all want from America? And it's that, how do you face the world?
Well, I think first facing the world, recognizing that we only have one mouth, but we have two ears. And Americans too frequently get that ratio inverted. I think that is a moment where, as we think about the changing nature of the economy, there are actually really positive examples for how to govern this, for how to manage a more inclusive society, for how labor can benefit in a world of increasing capital. But it's not all going to come from inside the United States. In my book, I write a little bit about the Scandinavian model for labor. I sit on the board of a publicly traded Swiss company, and I view the way that we interact with our workers' council, it would be unrecognizable in the United States at one of our publicly traded companies. So how do we engage? The first thing is, remember, you have one mouth and two ears, and allow for the possibility that you might actually have something to learn from somebody else. There's this caricature of Europe as inefficient, disorganized, lacking dynamism, and other such things. And I would contest that. I think that we have, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, I think there's remarkable dynamism, both within the private sector as well as within the public policy realm, that America could stand to learn a bit from. That's thing one. Thing two is, I think it needs to look outside of the architecture of its traditional alliances. Now, Trump wanted to do this in a sort of radical way. He wanted to align himself with, Bolsonaro and Putin and Duterte and the world's dictators. But I do think, look, I was a little critical of Obama earlier. One area where I do agree with him is that we do need to think of a world beyond just the G7. We need to recognize and legitimize the power of developing states. We need to have countries like Indonesia and South Korea and Chile and Kenya and many others at the grown-ups table, so to speak, as opposed to sort of as, these sort of public demonstrations of benevolence. So the other thing that I would say is the United States needs to be a bit less elitist in terms of with whom it works and how it works. It needs to be more intentional on a variety of different issues, and climate foremost among them, I believe, and thinking about how we can build alliances, how we can construct networks in ways that go against the patterns of our past.
I could see scribbling, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, well, no, I very much agree with that. And I love Alex, 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I would just say another area we actually are beginning to learn from Europe and from Singapore is apprenticeships, right? Rethinking our workforce, and really Alex's chapter on how we're going to rebuild labor power is really important, and it's essential. We are not going to get the kind of balance with the power of these corporations unless we can find a way for workers to exercise much more power. I very much agree that the United States needs to move from global policeman to global problem solver. It is not something that most foreign policy elites are trained to do. They like defense and diplomacy, and they like it with other foreign ministries, and they prefer to do it with great powers. But what we need to do in the world is lead with, not over, and particularly around development. And development has been the third D and definitely the second-class citizen. But the way to do that is to recognize that development is not foreign aid for those benighted countries over there. Development is domestic policy for everybody. Development is education and health and jobs and food security. And we have those issues just as much as other countries do. Obviously, we are richer, but we have unbelievable inequality. We have the highest rate of maternal mortality in the OECD. We can learn even from some developing countries there. So a vision that says, look, I heard Larry Summers say it this morning, which was kind of something. He said, global pandemics and climate change pose a far greater threat than any other country. It's time to move off of an obsession with great power politics and look at the real threats to all of our people. And there the United States has an important role to play, but it is a role with other countries. In the chat, somebody said, join us at the table, not, we are the hegemon, we are the indispensable nation. We are a great nation, and we have a lot to teach, but we also have a lot to learn.
That's a really a brilliant summary. It as you rightly say, it does feel like the power that the US can exercise is not to be commander-in-chief, but more convener-in-chief. You can bring people to the table. Goodness me, there might even be a post-Brexit role for Britain in that. I'm not sure what else we can bring to the table, but we might be able to encourage people to chat. There's a line in Anne-Marie's book. I'm going to have to wrap up, I realise, because we're coming to the end of our hour. But there is a line in her book about what she describes as the Declaration of Interdependence, and muses about whether that 250th anniversary in a few years' time might actually be an uplifting moment of reckoning and reflection, where much could be made of the fact that the US is transitioning from a white majority to a plurality nation, and can hold up a mirror to itself and to the world, and really sort of open doors, speak the language of every nation on earth, and actually work in a constructive way. I love some of the language of tonight. I think the one mouth, two ears is going to stay with me. Global policeman, no more, but problem solver in on the world stage feels like the right instinct. And I would just also close, I think, by saying, let us not in the UK give ourselves a free pass here. We if the US struggles with its long and ignoble history, Britain has a very strong part to play in the slavery story and in the story of empire, and is still struggling to acknowledge the long tail of both of those issues. So it does feel to me like there's a whole other night we could have trying to address the question, what is the UK for now? I'm not sure we'd find a good answer or a comfortable one, but as ever, it's been gripping to talk to people who have been at the centre of Washington politics and try to go into an administration with noble thoughts, and then realise that not everything can be done as easily as it can be said. But Alec, Anne-Marie, I really appreciate your contributions tonight, and I think if people want to read more of your thoughts, those two books are definitely worth grabbing. So thanks so much for getting involved, and I hope we'll see you all again soon.